To Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. My name is Helen Garcia, and you're listening to the very first episode of the new theme for the next 12 episodes that we're releasing for our podcast called Cinema Therapy. Today, I sit with one of our fellow therapists at Yellow Chair Collective, Angela Nguyen, and we talk about The Good Place. Now, The Good Place is a show about philosophical morality. It explores things from a very non-religious and non-traditional lens. And today you're going to get a couple of takeaways. We work through guilt, shame, the influence of childhood in our environment, and the importance of growth and healing. The characters in The Good Place often grapple with these questions and explore different philosophies on what good is. So today we're going to tie the role of media and mental health and how you can practically use some of these questions and complexities of what it means to be a good person and apply a sense of self-compassion, persistence, and unlearning shame and growing from your mistakes in today's episode. And so without further ado, thank you for listening to Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, and let's start the show. You're the first episode for Cinema Therapy I'm recording, and I'm actually so glad that you chose The Good Place because I know The Good Place. And I'm excited to talk to you about it, but I'm curious as to like how you got into the show and what you like about it.
Yeah, I think it was just a show that I happened to like stumble across on Netflix. You know, it's like the one streaming subscription I had, and I saw it was a new show, and I thought I was like, oh, interesting premise. I'd give it a try. And it's a show that I keep coming back to. I think like the cast is so good, and I think the characters are so easy to root for, right? And I think the messaging is really interesting, and like the concept of itself is really interesting, and so I got like hooked. And then they kept me for the entirety of the show, and I think also the way that it ended, like they didn't drag it on. They were like,
they didn't.
We did our message, we're done, and then they stopped.
Yeah, what I found fascinating, like jumping to it, was when they finally land in heaven at the end of the series, like sort of at the end, and they try to escape from it. I thought it was really interesting because people think that heaven is a place without any issues. And I just thought that the concept of it, of like, what would a world look like without any problems, would we actually find it fulfilling? So there were all of these things that I feel like we could talk about, but you did have certain points. But the first thing that you said, Angela, was, what does it mean to be a good person? And how can we work through our own guilt and shame for our past actions? And I'm curious what you make of that when you think of the show.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm supposed to give any background on the show or if that would be helpful at all.
Yeah, background would be good.
Yeah, so essentially the premise of the show is that it follows this small cast of characters, right? These are all humans who have died and have now gone on into the afterlife. And I think one of the things that is funny and quirky, and also what pulled me in, is that they don't subscribe to any one like spiritual or religious understanding of the afterlife. They kind of just give their own interpretation of like, there's a good place, a place up there where, hey, if you did good, you get to go up there. And there's a bad place where somewhere down there, if you weren't good on earth, then you go down there instead, right? And so the characters, right, are essentially in the afterlife and having to figure out what that afterlife looks like for them, right? What does the good place mean for them? What does the bad place mean for them? And so, by definition, the show starts with trying to figure out what is a good person. And I think the thing that they find, and it's like the big question of the show, is that it's really complicated. It's really complicated to define what is a good person. And the cool thing is, I think they explore like a lot of different philosophies. Of course, in a shallow way, it's still a sitcom, right? Yeah. But they think about like, okay, yeah, what does this philosophy say? Or what does this philosopher think, right? But the thing they keep coming back to is the idea that it is our actions and our actions over time and our efforts and our intent and our meaning that really contributes to what it means to be a good person, right? I think one of the points, right, is that, someone like Tahani, who the impact of her actions was all good, but what did she do it for, right? And that's kind of a question that they have to explore. Or, for characters like Chidi, who was so careful to never do anything bad as much as he could, but that actually impacted his relationships in arguably pretty negative ways.
Yeah.
Right? So it's really this big question of, well, how do you define good? I don't think there's an answer. I think it's that we always are trying to do a little bit better than we were doing the day before, right? We try to be cognizant and cautious of, what are our values and what are our personal morals and what are our personal ethics, and also how are our actions affecting the people around us, right? It's not just the impact, but it's also not just the intent, right? It's also like the context. It's also all the things around it, right? Like one of the, higher beings in the show, right? The judge of the whole afterlife. Her example is that like trying to just buy a tomato at the market,
Played by Maya
right?
Rudolph. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like she is trying to just, get a vegetable. But if you really go down the rabbit hole, you can think about like the negative impact of water consumption. You can think about the negative impact of the agricultural workers who had to produce that tomato, right? And you can really keep going and think about all of the ways that any one action can impact anyone else. And I think that really tells us that it is so complicated. But the point is, right, that that's not actually a helpful or a fruitful way to think about what it means to be good, right? And so the idea that they kind of come to at the end of the show, particularly through like Ted Danson, right, who plays Michael in the show, is that one, I think that trying does matter. Like actively trying to do good things and good actions does matter in the end. In the ways that what it means for you and in the ways that what it means for the people around you. And that people fundamentally are good, right? And they get to show that and they get to be that when they have their basic needs met, when they have support and resources and like access to goodness around them, right? For the characters who didn't really have that in life, right, on Earth, and then they did get that in the afterlife, they all got the chance to like show what it could be to be a good person. So the premise of like growth and healing, that you don't exist in a vacuum. You exist in a world that is connected to all of these other things. But it does matter what you do and what you try to do.
Yeah. I love that answer because I think it really over indexes more on effort and growth over time as opposed to already being the embodiment of perfect, similar to like the contrast you said with Tahani. And it kind of made me think of where Eleanor started in the first season, where she convinces Chidi to give her philosophy lessons so that she can understand how to be a good person. And then how that starts to kind of evolve, and she's having these really intelligent conversations. And I'm curious about, when you think about the writing and you think about Eleanor's life and all of the things that she's had to go through, how do you think our childhood and our environment plays into what we see as good and how we understand all of that? Because I think, similar to the show Evolving, you see it go from a really superficial view of my actions define whether or not I'm good and into the underlying reasons why you make the decisions that you make.
Yeah, I think maybe starting at like the root of it, right? I think our childhood experiences create the blueprint for how we navigate the world, right? It essentially creates a foundation for how we approach other people, how we approach the context and the environment in which we live in, how we navigate our understanding of ourselves and our understandings of, again, like morals and ethics and values, right? And so the childhood that we get, right, I think whether or not we like it, really does define how we, grow into our adulthood, right? And for a character like Eleanor, who, really didn't have the support from the adult caregivers around her, didn't really have access to like resources that could have helped her, she had to learn to become her own defender, right? Her own protector. And so she entered into life always on the defensive, right? Always trying to make sure that she protected herself and what she needed and what she wanted, to the detriment, right, of the relationships around her. And so if we're thinking about, in a character like that, or, in a childhood, then adulthood like that, absolutely, it does affect, right, the ways that we understand ourselves and the ways that we approach others. And notably, when Eleanor gets exposure to different people and different environments and different ways of being, she's able to grow from that and heal, right, from her own childhood experiences, and, to be able to tackle things in a different way. And I think importantly, even as she like builds these relationships with these characters, she's still like, in her words, like Arizona trash, right? And that's not, of course, to say anything about people from Arizona, right? But like, she still keeps parts of herself, and she still views life through those parts of herself in conjunction with like these other ways that she has learned to be. Like one of my favorite scenes is she jokes with Chidi. She's like, "Come on, nerd, I'm really trying here," right? And I think that's just the definition of, yeah, we are always trying and we are always growing, and it's hard, and we are having to oftentimes combat or challenge the ways that we are used to being. I think I may have sidetracked your original question a little bit, but hopefully I answered it.
You did answer my question, because you talked about like, it's important to know the context about where we came from. And I started to think back to my childhood of like, I'm curious about whether or not you can relate to any of this, but I didn't get a lot of access to what it meant to be a good person until I actually sought it out when I was like 14, 15. Like I had access to like church resources, and like that's where I started to really get into spirituality and religion. But in terms of the characters that you empathize with the most and which ones you think you're most like, I want to hear your perspective of, was there a character that you really liked that you felt like you can relate to in a lot of ways, childhood-wise, life-wise, decisions-wise?
Yeah, I think that is such a good question. And I think part of the reason I love the show so much is that, you can kind of see yourself in all of the characters in some ways, right? I think for me, I really resonated actually with Tahani, not in the ways where I grew up, with access to, economic resources and means, certainly not in that way.
Okay. I was like, I had no idea there was a side of you, Angela.
No. Yeah, definitely, grew up as, a child of immigrants who were always like actively fighting for survival, right? And always actively trying to make sure that, we had a roof over our heads and food on the table, right? But what I think, or how I really relate to Tahani, is this idea of like, she was always striving to live up to her parents' expectations, right? She had to be perfect, right? She had to do everything that they wanted her to do and more, right? That she always had to be going for better. Whatever that she did was, okay, great, but keep going, right? Keep doing more, keep being better. And so for Tahani, one of the things that she finds really challenging is she didn't get a ton of affirmation and validation for herself, just as like who she is, not her accomplishments, not her performance, but who she is as a person. And she's in the show, right, trying to still get that affirmation, that validation from those external sources, right, from her parents, from the people around her, from all the people that like she works with in her various efforts, right? And I think that feels really relatable of, what it looks like to separate your identity and your sense of self from your performance, right? And from your accomplishments. And I think that is the part I really resonate with, of like, oh, okay, I do have to learn how to affirm and validate my own emotions, right? And my own experiences and my own traits and characteristics and the bits and pieces of myself that have nothing to do with how much money I make or the job I end up working in or, you know, the literal awards or accomplishments or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I think that feels like really relatable to me. And also, you know, as the one, oh, don't quote me on this. I believe she's South Asian, right?
She is, yeah.
Yeah. Because I know the actor is. I couldn't remember if I was conflating that with the character. But yeah, also being able to resonate, like, yeah, what it means to just be like an Asian person in a world where, right, like, I think her character's from like the UK, right? And I think the show is, I mean, set in the afterlife, but a lot of the characters and actors are American, right?
Yeah.
So in these very much non-Eastern parts of the world, right? What it means to be so different and what it means to be like trying to find our place in that. Yeah, I think I really related to her.
The way that you put it is so relatable of, I felt like who I was wasn't enough. So I had to kind of keep moving the needle. And like, I have personal experience in that too. But I want to know, was there a moment that things started to change for you, similar to the character? When it comes to like balancing being able to understand the try of life, but also knowing that there needs to be a level of compassion for your experience. Like what was that moment for you? Similar to the Tahani moment where she started to like piece that for herself.
Yeah, I think for me it was college. And I think similarly to Tahani and similarly to these other characters, it's like when you finally get to an environment that's so different from the one that you were raised in, that's so different from the one that you grew up in, where you now have access to different people and different views and different perspectives and to resources that you may not have ever had before. For me, you know, being able to go to college was one, getting to see Asian people in a way that I had never seen before, because I grew up in a predominantly like Latinx Hispanic community. So I didn't really grow up around Asian people at all. And so that was like, whoa, that was so different for me. But then also, right, getting to meet people from like all over the country, right, or all over the world, hearing different perspectives, hearing different views, having access to therapy for the first time in my life. The first time I ever gone to individual therapy was in college, right, through, you know, the College Counseling Center. So having access to things like that, being able to start to explore and pick for myself, what are the things that I'm interested in? What are the majors I might like to pursue? What is the work I might eventually pursue? And having all of these options laid out for me in a way that I'd never thought of before, right? So the exposure was huge. And then I think also the friends that I made, I think were of a much deeper friendship than I think I had the chance for earlier in life. But I think part of that also, right, has to do with like you're a little bit older in college, right? You're all a little bit more mature, ideally, hopefully, right? But you're also choosing people in a way that you didn't really get to choose in like high school or middle school, right? Like you made friends in high school, which absolutely, I love my friends in high school. But you kind of made them through proximity, right? These are the people that were around you. But in a college, you don't have to become friends with your classmates. You can be friends with like so many different people all over the campus, right? And so you really get to experience, I think, friendships that are chosen and made, right? Rather than ones that kind of just happen to be there. And that's absolutely not to devalue high school friendships at all, you know?
I think high school is a hit or miss for a lot of people, you know?
It was a miss for me.
Same. Same for me. It was one of the most depressing periods of my life, to say the least.
Same.
Yeah. And
I think that's why I got to college and I was like, I need therapy.
Same. Yeah, me too. 18 was like a really pivotal year for me. But going back to you, I think what you just said parallels a lot of The Good Place, if you will. And I'll tell you
Yeah.
what I mean by that. Because Eleanor only knew her context and she wasn't given a lot of access. And so she had to die to really choose the path that she wanted to lay out for herself. And in a lot of ways, like we have a lot of deaths to self in different stages of life. And so it sounds like high school Angela was very different from college Angela. And we have a lot of clients coming in to therapy for grief, for loss, for heartbreak. And similar to the themes that you just talked about with like how much you've changed, like, can you tell me how you encourage other people to embrace those changes? Because what I'm hearing too is newness, seeing opportunity to things, accepting death are some of the key themes that we've been talking about recently.
Yeah, I think, how do I say this? I think part of it, right, is that one, recognizing that newness is hard, right?
Yeah.
Being in a new environment, it is hard. It is confusing. Trying to change the ways that you've always been, trying to change your actions or your patterns. And right, we talk a lot about this in therapy, right? Like the patterns of thinking or the patterns of acting, right? It's hard to change those things, right? And even if you think about changing those things, even if you think it's a good idea to change those things, that doesn't change that it is really, really challenging.
That's
right?
so true.
And then it takes time. And it also takes support, right? Again, like we don't exist in a vacuum, you know? If everyone around you is not encouraging of the ways that you're trying to change or of the ways that you're trying to do things differently, that adds to how difficult it is, right? Or that adds to how difficult it can be. So I think in thinking about like, you know, what we have to go through or what we have to experience or what we have to learn from in order to start making those adjustments. I think being able to like validate and affirm ourselves and that this is really, really hard. And it also matters, right? And that even just taking like the small steps along the way, like that is still growth and that is still progress. And sometimes I think importantly, what the show mentions too is that it's not just about always like actively growing as a person. It's also about, you know, investing and growing in your relationships with the people who matter to you and like having the community that around you is supporting you and nourishing you and that you support and nourish in return.
That's good.
Right. And also, right, I think Chidi sort of makes a little bit of a joke about it.
I was going to transition
sometimes,
into that.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if we're going on the same transition, but one of the things he mentions is like, I don't want to read philosophy. I just want to go sit on a river or a lake and just be. And I think that's important too. You know, like sometimes it's not always about like this upward trend. Sometimes you have to rest too. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah. You're right. We weren't going on the same trajectory because there's something that you said about, actually, maybe it is the same thing, you can argue, but like you talk about going on this upward trajectory. And there's this scene like before Chidi dies where he's like having a sweat of indecision. I don't remember exactly what happened, but he's sweating. And then because of his indecision, something falls on him and he dies. And like there's something about having the knowledge of what it means to be a good person and actually living the best life, you know, you can live, that I feel like there's a lot of anxiety nowadays about making the right decision or so much access to personal development and coaching that, you know, you speak to. It's not just about growing as a person, it's also cultivating the relationships. And so we have a lot of listeners at the podcast who do have those questions of what does it mean to live a relationally healthy life? And especially since we work with a lot of Asian Americans, there's a lot of high achievement oriented in that. And so do you think that we have an epidemic of just a lack of relational health happening right now in our society just based on that analysis? Or how would you describe that?
I have so many thoughts on this point, and I'm trying to think of where to start.
You can start wherever you want.
I might ramble a little bit,
Please.
and hopefully we find the thread in it.
Okay.
The first thought that I'm thinking, right, is that when it comes to cultivating these relationships around us and when it comes to cultivating the communities around us, I think Chidi is such a good example, right? Because his indecisiveness is very obviously pointed out to him, but it does actually hurt the people around him, right? But for the most part, the people around him, while they do call him out on it and try to hold him accountable for it, they don't shame him for it, right? And the scene where he ultimately ends up dying, right? His best friend has actually already tried to account for and accommodate who he is and how he is, right? And I think that's part of it, that we have to recognize the impact that our actions have on others. And we have to be the ones to like make those efforts and make those changes. But when we're in relationships with people who can account for us and can accommodate for us and can meet us halfway, I think it makes all the difference, right? And I think something that we've been exploring, particularly in the pandemic, particularly for Asian and Asian American communities, is that it can't just be about the individual, it's also got to be about the community. It's got to be about supporting community care, supporting community resilience, creating access in our communities, raising awareness, raising education, right? We don't exist in silos. So I think that's the first part of like, as much as we have to work on ourselves in order to better our communities and our relationships, we're also bettered by the communities and the relationships around us. Right? It's a bidirectional relationship. So that's kind of the first point that I was thinking.
Yeah.
And I also want to comment that that's hard to find too. Like that's hard to create. That's hard to find. It's hard to build. And I think it's something that we have to do in a really active way. If that makes sense.
That does make sense.
The second point. Oops, sorry.
No, you're good.
Go ahead.
I was reading a study actually before I met with you about men, especially Asian men, South Pacific men, and how this word accountability is actually really predominant among the culture and also around the male like hierarchy right now. And it was a study done on dating, and only 10% of men, the top 10% of men, would actually get matches, and the other 90% would have to try to find ways to, quote, increase their attractiveness, if you will. And there's also a higher likelihood of suicidality as a result of that epidemic of loneliness. And so I love the point that you made of it's this fine balance that we have to strike of, yes, I want to grow as a person, but also I know I can't do it alone. And it takes a lot of humility and patience in order to cultivate that vision and make it come to life. But that was just my 2 cents going into it.
Yeah, actually, that's a perfect jumping off point, because my second point was going to be like the loneliness epidemic that is being talked about, that we are hearing more and more about, online and in social media conversation. And I think it's true, right? It's this really weird thing where social media is making us more connected than we were ever before. And also, we are less connected than we were ever before.
That's so true.
Like, I am more connected in that now as an adult, I have a much better understanding of like what's happening in places like Palestine, right? Whereas I wouldn't have had that 10 years ago, because that sort of access to information and to like first account stories wasn't that easy. And then yet also, we're working from home. The pandemic made us quarantine. We're seeing like very fast and drastic changes to like the dating landscape, right? We're seeing increases, like you mentioned, of like mental health concerns. We're seeing increases in things like suicidality, right? There are so many issues that are happening all right now. And I think it really does speak to the loneliness that a lot of people are feeling. And I think that goes across age group too, right? It's folks in their 20s and 30s, which is the age group that personally I'm most familiar with. But that's also the case for older individuals, right? It's also the case for younger individuals, right? And thinking about the clients that I've worked with, like I've heard it from like 30-year-olds who, yeah, are also really feeling the loneliness, particularly so prompted by the pandemic and the world, right? And how social media actually feels isolating, right? You are in these parasocial relationships as opposed to these really intimate and personal relationships. And I've also heard that from like 15-year-olds, right? Who, you know, one, their ability to make friendships was so impaired, right, by like not being able to be in schools. But also the pressures now that they're seeing and facing on social media. So I think it's definitely such a real thing, and I think it's definitely so complicated. And as a late 20-something myself in the dating world, boy howdy, is it challenging.
It's so challenging. I can't imagine being in high school and having that happen, especially having like anxiety and puberty happening at the same time. Like, I feel like I'm still getting over the pandemic right now. But anyways, I feel like we kind of got into a tangent. But one of the things that I kind of want to touch on is, to your point, because we have more access to social media, because we have all of these parasocial relationships, there is a role that cinema and media can play in our understanding and compassion for mental health at times, especially for people that are still learning to reintegrate themselves back in society. And I wanted to ask, like, when it comes to this point of loneliness that we kind of touched on, how do you think we can begin to use media, similar to what we've been doing in The Good Place, to have a better understanding of our mental health and anxiety without judging ourselves?
Yeah. So I actually use or have used The Good Place as an example in like some of my own sessions with clients.
Okay.
Yeah, it's come up. Oh, but regardless of whether it's The Good Place or other media or other shows,
Yeah.
Two key points that I want to start off with before I like really answer the question. The first is that not all representation is good representation. I think there's definitely room for us to acknowledge that like moving the needle is helpful and is beneficial, and also that negative representation can be more harmful than it is helpful.
Yeah.
That's kind of the first point that I wanted to note. And the second point that I wanted to note is that sometimes being able to have a little bit of distance from whatever it is that we're working on, being able to step outside of our shoes for a second and look at a different perspective and look at a different viewpoint or look at a different person can really give us a better understanding of ourselves.
Wow.
Right? And so how I would apply this in session is, one, sometimes I think for a lot of people who really struggle with self-compassion, it is so much easier to try to offer compassion to someone else first, right? And to see what that could look like and to see how that could help someone else or that could help improve things for someone else. And then seeing that impact, being able to then apply it to ourselves of like, okay, I can see how self-compassion could be really important, or I could see the ways that it could make a difference, right? So like taking the example of Eleanor again, right? She, especially in that first season where she's still learning, she makes some mistakes, right? She says some pretty mean things and she's pretty rude or she's inconsiderate at times, right? And then she feels guilty for it. She doesn't like it, right? She doesn't like feeling guilty for it. But she tries to make up for it, right? And the characters around her comment that that's growth, that that's change, right? That you can recognize when you haven't done something well and you can feel guilty for it, right? And you can make up for it and you can change it and you can try to be cognizant about that the next time. But importantly, that change doesn't happen in punishment. It doesn't happen in cruelty or being mean or judging her, right? It happens in kindness and understanding. And so I think oftentimes we don't always think about like accountability and compassion as being coexisting things, but I think accountability is like part of compassion. That when we are trying to offer grace and understanding to people around us and to ourselves, it also means being honest and authentic to our morals and our ethics and values. And yeah, holding ourselves accountable when those things don't align and doing something about it, but not doing so in a way where we're punishing anyone or ourselves. Because if that worked, it would have worked a long time ago.
Yeah.
You know?
Punishing yourself doesn't work. That's a good one. For people that don't know what you do at YCC, you write a lot of our posts online.
I do.
And you've also written a ton of content for other people. And I'm curious as to, like, are there any themes from The Good Place that have influenced how you write and how you think? And I have a follow-up question after that, but I'll withhold so I don't overwhelm you with my questions. Plural.
Yeah. I think the takeaway messages that I've gotten from The Good Place and that I think I've like really internalized and tried to like incorporate into the ways that I communicate like my thoughts on like mental health or my thoughts on like what it means to be a good person is one, again, that like people are good, I think. That like at our core, we are good. And it's what we learn and what we experience and the context in which we live that really affects the way that that is able to come out.
Yeah.
Right? Or in the way that that is able to be expressed. Right? When we have our basic needs met, when we have support, when we have the resources that we need, when we have models, when we have access, right? I think all of that allows us to be good. And like what they mentioned in the show is like when you don't have that, right? It makes sense that you aren't able to be quote unquote a good person, right? Yeah, actually, it makes sense that you had to be selfish if you were never able to get your needs met. That was the only way that you could make that happen.
Yeah.
It makes sense, right? The other 2 points that I find that like really have stuck with me is one, the characters mentioned that soulmates, if they do exist, they're made and they're not created.
That's so
and
good.
I really want to apply that. Like, I don't want to think just about romantic relationships. I think we definitely need to think more about our platonic relationships.
That's good.
Right? So our relationships, right? Our good relationships are created, right? They take the time and the energy and the effort and the reciprocity to be in a good relationship, right? And we don't just fall into that. Like, we have to be actively doing that to make that happen. And I think the last piece is this idea of like death and meaning and fulfillment. And so personally, I was raised Buddhist, or like in a family that is like culturally Buddhist. And so I never really had an understanding of like an afterlife, right? My family believes in reincarnation. And also there's an element of, at least in my family, of like ancestor worship. So there might be an afterlife. I don't know. It's confusing, right? But this idea that death, you know what? It is scary. It is. It is a big, giant, unknown question that people throughout history, all of the world, have tried to answer in their own ways. And I mean, who really knows who's right? Right? But what they talk about in the show is that death, it actually makes life a little bit more meaningful, right? How they ultimately form the good place is one that eventually has an end, right? And that the end is what helps us find meaning, right? That what we do matters because eventually it does end, right? And also that what we do and what we find meaning in is so individualized and so unique, right? Because we can all find our own meanings and we can create our own meanings. And whatever that looks like does matter. It is fulfilling to you, right? And it is meaningful to you. And also that it ends. And I think that's what makes life a little bit special. I lied. I had actually had a last point.
Please.
But one theme that Chidi always comes back to is he quotes this book, which I have never read personally, but it's What We Owe to Each Other. I actually don't know if it's a real book.
Okay.
But it's this idea that, like, what do we owe to each other, like, as people, as humans, in living in a society? like coexisting with other people, right? And I think it really speaks to this really weird tension of like Western individualism versus like Eastern collectivism, right? Where in our more Western cultures, it is all about like you, yourself, and like what you're doing and what you're fighting for and what your goals are. And for the Eastern collectivism, it's more about like your unit, your family, your community, uplifting all of the people around you. And I think a lot of Asian Americans like myself, especially in like the millennial, Gen Z, and younger generations, are trying to figure that out, right? What it means to have both of these pieces.
Yeah.
And what it means to like integrate both of these pieces into ourselves and how we, choose our life paths, right? And not that I have an answer, because I think the answer is one that's always changing.
Yeah.
But I think the idea from that quote or that book, or at least what Katie says, is regardless of how you choose to understand culture and how you choose to understand community, I think we owe some level of basic decency and kindness to each other. And I think, at times we do have to fend for ourselves and we do have to protect ourselves and prioritize ourselves. And at other times we do want to show up for other people and we do want to be there for them, sometimes at the expense of ourselves, right? And I don't think there's any one way to go about that. I think the balance is what matters, but I think it is holding that core of like decency to other people.
Yeah.
And you kind of figure out the rest from there.
Yeah. It's like the opportunity to rediscover and to just notice and to come back, notice, come back, notice, come back. Because to your point, like as an Asian American, Southeast Asian American, I think one of the biggest struggles that I've had to face was this, similar to your issues that we discussed, of culture, individualism, self-care that's being promoted right now in American society. What is that balance? And I think that sometimes people tend to over-index on one end and on the other end.
Yeah.
And the pendulum is always swinging. I feel like if you kind of look at life like that, it's kind of like you have to be able to move with the season that you're in. It's never one or the other. And so I like that you kind of remove the legalism out of it, just so people can have permission to kind of learn as they go. And that's a really great lesson. It's a refreshing lesson.
Yeah, I think the analogy that I use all the time with my clients, and if any of them are listening to this, I use this all the time. But it's like when you're in a plane, they always tell you to put on your own oxygen mask first. And I think that speaks to, right, the importance of self-care. Like you have to sustain yourself in order to be able to do anything else. But then they note, right, and then putting it on for the people around you, right? The children or elders or whoever around you who is struggling, right?
Yeah.
So I still think it's a huge question that I don't think necessarily we can answer, right? What it means to be a good person individually and in community. But I think the premise of it was that it's complicated, you know?
Yeah. And I love that you chose the good place, because there was never a clear answer. There was always nuance to a huge question, like where do people go when we die? Where do bad people go when we die? And what I loved about today's interview was that each character that we analyzed today, Michael, Tahani, Eleanor, and Chidi, they seemed really good on the surface. And then the more that you got to know their humanity, they had both elements of what you would call good and what you would call bad, and opportunities for growth along the way. And I think it really created ground, to your point of, it's not about that. It's about being able to cultivate a balance of relationship, community, and self-growth. And it's not one or the other. And it's like welcoming all parts of yourself in. It kind of reminds me of inner child work a little bit. Like knowing what parts of you come out in certain areas. So that was really good, Angela.
Yeah. Thank you.
So one final question, because I know that today's interview was 45 minutes and it's around like 44. But for people who might be struggling with anxiety or with a lot of shame and guilt about where they've come from, the mistakes that they've made, One of the questions that we always get on the podcast is like, what are some action steps that I can apply after I listen to today's interview? Do you have any that you'd like to suggest before I let you go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good question. And I think it's a question that we're all kind of, trying to navigate, right? Of, hey, I've done something that I think is bad, or I've made some mistakes, and how do I make peace with that? And what do I do about that, right? One, I think it's important to differentiate between guilt and shame, right? Guilt is the sort of the natural feeling that we feel when, we do something that doesn't align, right, with what we believe. Whereas I think shame is the feeling that, while absolutely valid to feel, is one that is often a lot less helpful, right? Because it takes what we've done and turns it into a reflection of who we are, right? And I think if there's anything that The Good Place did try to teach over the course of the show, is that it's not just 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 actions that define who you are, right? So that self-compassion in this case, I think, means being able to say, hey, okay, you know what? I did mess up. I did make that mistake. I didn't like that. It doesn't align, right, with what I believe. And maybe it did really hurt me or the people around me, and that's not okay. And also, right, that doesn't mean that I am a bad person, or that I'm always going to be a bad person, or that I could never become a good person. It just means that we need to learn from it and maybe make up for it, right? Rebuild the trust in ourselves, or rebuild the trust that we have in our other relationships. And, make sure not to do that again, or not to repeat that again, right? But to grow from it, to hold ourselves accountable, to grow from it. And importantly, again, in the compassion piece, is not to punish ourselves for it, because that doesn't really get you anywhere. So if you've made a mistake, show up for yourself, be honest, be authentic, learn from it, let yourself grow from it. If it comes back and it haunts you, because I know it does, it certainly happens to me. Oh God, why did I say that thing in the 10th grade?
I've done that.
But to give yourself that time of like, hey, 10th grade you maybe did know better, maybe didn't, but knows better now, right? And isn't going to repeat that now. Or is going to try really hard not to repeat that now. And I think that effort is what matters.
Yeah. It's like the metric that you're using matters, and being able to analyze what that is. Is that sort of what you're saying?
I think it's effort, really. I think that's what I always come back to, right? And it's something that I talk a lot, too, about. I don't think it's so much about consistency. Like, it's not always about doing the same things or doing these sets of things over and over, forever and ever. But I think it's a lot of the time more about persistence, that we keep coming back, and that we keep trying, and we keep figuring out and navigating and building and rebuilding as we go along.
That's so good. Angela, thanks so much for your time today. I learned a lot from you. Especially as like a self-professed perfectionist. I loved having you. This was so fun.
No, I love that I got to talk about the show. Again, it is one of my favorite shows. I think it's got so many life lessons. For a sitcom, so many life lessons,
So many. But also, like, thank you for being vulnerable enough to bring some of yourself into the interview, too. Because I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, thank you for saying so. I think it's kind of one of the cool things about being able to be a therapist who has been a client first, right? I think it's being able to show up like authentically as just another person, as just another human. And I think the more we normalize these sorts of conversations, the more we talk about mental health in a way that's like validating and affirming, I think the easier it is to continue to tackle these sorts of issues. So,
Nice. If you've made it to the end of the episode, I think you deserve a thank you. Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, wouldn't be anything without followers like you. I promise you that the production of these podcasts will continue to increase as the listeners increase and the followers increase. And so if you can do me a favor If you found any value from this podcast episode, please give this a like, share, or subscribe to the show. It really helps us out. It keeps the word going and it helps our impressions. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Friday.